My name is Morgan Ellis, and I was holding a half-eaten sandwich and a cup of lukewarm coffee when I heard it. A single word, spoken by the new Chief Technology Officer, sealed the end of my 12-year tenure at Nixora Systems. Replaceable. The only problem, I was the only person who truly understood how their system actually worked. I stood frozen in the doorway of Conference Room B, watching Preston Dale gesture dismissively at a PowerPoint slide displaying my department's organizational chart. My name appeared in a red box marked Legacy Personnel, Optimization Target. The sandwich turned to cardboard in my mouth as I absorbed the clinical brutality of corporate speak. The Ellis position represents outdated thinking, Preston continued, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had never built anything from scratch. We need agile solutions, not entrenched maintenance protocols. I backed away slowly, my stomach churning. 12 years of 60-hour weeks, of emergency calls at 2 a.m., of single-handedly keeping their financial systems running through 3 major upgrades and countless minor catastrophes. 12 years of being the person they called when everything else failed. Replaceable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Preston Dale, with his MBA from Wharton and his consultant speak, had been hired 6 months ago to modernize operations. He'd spent exactly 0 minutes understanding the intricate web of custom scripts, legacy integrations, and carefully orchestrated workarounds that kept Nixora's billing system functioning. The system I had designed, built, and maintained with the meticulous care of a surgeon. Over the following weeks, I watched my professional life erode with methodical precision. Meeting invitations stopped arriving. My input was no longer requested for system updates. When I tried to voice concerns about removing certain redundant monitoring scripts, I was told the decision had already been made at a higher level. The final insult came on a Tuesday morning in October. I had just finished a routine maintenance cycle that ensured the billing system would run smoothly for the next 3 months. The automated processes were humming along perfectly. Customer invoices were generating without error. And the backup systems were synchronized across all servers. I had literally just prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure, working through the weekend to implement a patch that would save the company millions in potential downtime. My reward was an email from Human Resources, not even a phone call. An email. Dear Morgan, due to organizational restructuring, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Please report to HR to collect your personal belongings. Your final paycheck will be processed within 2 weeks. Thank you for your service to Nixora Systems. No signature, no explanation, no acknowledgement of more than a decade of dedication. I stared at the screen for a full minute, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The cruelty of the timing was breathtaking. They had waited until I finished fixing their system, then discarded me like a used tool. My corporate access was revoked before I even stood up from my desk. The key card that had gotten me through the front doors every morning for 12 years was suddenly as useful as a piece of plastic. My internal accounts were deleted, my email access terminated, my projects reassigned to people who had no idea what they were inheriting. The walk to HR was a blur of shocked faces and awkward condolences. News traveled fast in a mid-sized company, and my colleagues looked at me with the mixture of sympathy and relief that comes from witnessing someone else's execution. They knew what I knew. If Morgan Ellis wasn't safe, nobody was. My personal belongings fit into a single cardboard box, a coffee mug from a conference 5 years ago, a small cactus that had survived countless late nights, a framed photo of my cat, Pixel. 12 years of professional life reduced to objects that could be carried in 2 hands. I drove home to my small apartment in downtown Grayford, Illinois, in a state of emotional numbness. The city looked different somehow, as if I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The familiar streets and buildings felt foreign, temporary. Everything I had built my identity around was gone. But as I sat in my living room, staring at the cardboard box on my coffee table, something cold and calculating began to form in my mind. Preston Dale and his restructuring team had made a critical error. They had assumed that systems could be maintained by anyone, that institutional knowledge was transferable, that the person who designed something was ultimately unnecessary. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I opened my laptop and began to work. Not frantically, not emotionally, but with the methodical precision that had made me indispensable for 12 years. I created a new folder on my desktop. Archive, System Skeleton. Into this folder went everything. Every design document I had created, every troubleshooting guide I had written, every custom script I had developed, every integration map I had drawn, every single piece of documentation that explained not just what the system did, but how it did it and why it worked. Most importantly, I began to document the things that weren't documented anywhere else. The unofficial fixes that had become essential. The manual processes that kept automated systems running. The delicate balance of interdependent services that could collapse if disturbed. The tribal knowledge that existed only in my head and nowhere else. I worked through the night, not out of panic, but out of professional thoroughness. By morning, I had created a comprehensive archive of everything that made Nixora's system function. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't answer my phone for the next 3 days. It rang constantly. Former colleagues, middle managers, even Preston Dale himself left increasingly desperate voicemails. I listened to each one with growing satisfaction, then deleted them without responding. The first sign of trouble came on Tuesday. A former coworker texted me, "Hey, the billing system isn't generating invoices. Do you know what might be wrong?" I read the message and set my phone aside. I was no longer employed by Nixora Systems. Their problems were no longer my problems. Wednesday brought more urgent messages. The automated invoice generation had failed completely. Customer bills that should have been sent out on the first of the month were stuck in the system. The backup processes that should have kicked in were non-functional. The monitoring scripts that would have alerted the team to the problem had been removed during the optimization phase. I made myself a cup of coffee and watched the news. The weather was turning cold, and I needed to buy groceries. Normal life continuing while somewhere across town. People were discovering that removing the person who understood the system had consequences. By Thursday, the panic was evident. My phone buzzed with messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. The director of finance, the customer service manager. Even the CEO's assistant was trying to reach me. Each message was more desperate than the last. The billing system failure was cascading into other problems. Customer payments couldn't be processed because the invoice numbers weren't generating correctly. Insurance claims were backing up because the automated verification system depended on billing data that wasn't updating. The loan processing system was throwing errors because it couldn't access customer account information that relied on billing system databases. I spent the day organizing my sock drawer. It was surprisingly therapeutic. Friday brought the first official communication from the company. An email from Preston Dale, the man who had called me legacy baggage and eliminated my position. The subject line read, "Urgent, temporary consulting opportunity." I opened it with genuine curiosity. "Dear Morgan, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our billing system and could use your expertise to resolve them quickly. This would be a short-term consulting arrangement. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Best regards, Preston Dale, CTO." I read the email 3 times, savoring the desperation barely concealed beneath the professional language. Then I began to craft my response. I researched consulting rates for system architecture specialists with my level of experience. Then I tripled that number. I drafted a formal consulting agreement that included payment terms, scope limitations, and liability disclaimers. I specified that all work would be billed at premium emergency rates, with payment required upfront for any engagement exceeding 4 hours. Most importantly, I included a clause that absolved me of any responsibility for systemic failures that occurred due to modifications made to systems I'd originally designed. If they wanted my help, they would have to acknowledge that the current crisis was entirely their creation. I attached the consulting agreement to my response and sent it back to Preston with a simple message. "Please review the attached terms. I'm available for emergency consulting services subject to the conditions outlined in the agreement." The response came within an hour. Terms accepted. When can you start? I smiled for the first time in weeks, but I wasn't ready to start. Not yet. I sent back another email. I'll need to review the current system status to provide an accurate assessment. Please send me a detailed report of all changes made to the billing system since October 1st, including removed scripts, modified databases, and personnel changes. The report arrived by email within 2 hours. It was exactly what I had expected, and somehow worse. Every safety net I had built over 12 years had been systematically dismantled. The redundant monitoring systems, removed as unnecessary overhead. The backup verification processes, eliminated as inefficient duplication. The custom error handling scripts, deleted as legacy code. They had taken a carefully engineered system and stripped it down to its bare essentials, like removing the safety features from a car because they added weight. The result was entirely predictable to anyone who understood how complex systems actually worked. I spent the weekend crafting my first consulting invoice. The header read, Consulting Services. Tier 3, Strategic Disaster Recovery. The hourly rate was astronomical. The time estimate was generous. The total amount was more than I had made in 3 months of regular employment. I added a note at the bottom. Initial assessment complete. System failure was caused by removal of critical monitoring and backup processes. Full restoration will require rebuilding safety mechanisms that were eliminated during recent optimization efforts. I sent the invoice on Monday morning and waited. The payment was processed within 4 hours, but I still wasn't ready to fix their system. Instead, I began to document everything that was wrong with it, every shortcut that had been taken, every warning that had been ignored, every best practice that had been abandoned in the name of efficiency. I created a comprehensive report detailing how the current crisis could have been prevented, who had made the decisions that led to the failure, and what the long-term consequences would be if the underlying problems weren't addressed. It was a masterpiece of technical documentation and corporate autopsy. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable when I was an employee. I sent the report to the Illinois State Banking Commission. Not directly, of course. That would have been unprofessional. Instead, I anonymously forwarded it to a regulatory compliance officer I'd met at a conference 2 years earlier, along with a note suggesting they might want to review Nexora's data handling procedures. The investigation began within days. Nexora Systems processed financial data for thousands of customers, including loan applications, insurance claims, and investment accounts. The state had a legitimate interest in ensuring their systems were properly maintained and secured. When the compliance officers requested documentation of recent system changes, Nexora had to provide the same report they had sent me, the one that showed systematic removal of safety and monitoring systems, the one that demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing cost reduction over system stability. I was called in as a technical expert to explain the significance of the changes that had been made. I sat in a conference room with 3 state officials and explained, in careful detail, how removing critical monitoring systems had led to the current crisis. In your professional opinion, one of the investigators asked, was this system failure predictable? I looked directly at the camera recording our session. Yes. Anyone with experience in system architecture would have known that removing these safety mechanisms would eventually lead to catastrophic failure. The warnings were documented in multiple reports over the past 6 months. And these warnings were ignored. They were explicitly overruled by executive management as part of a cost reduction initiative. The investigation made headlines in the local business press. Local tech company under state investigation for system failures. The article mentioned that Nexora had been unable to process customer invoices for over a week, causing significant disruption to their business operations. That's when I received the second official communication from the company. This time it came from the CEO himself, David Morrison, a man I had met exactly twice in 12 years. Morgan, I understand there have been some misunderstandings about your departure from Nexora. We'd like to discuss bringing you back as a consultant to help resolve our current technical issues. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon? I replied with a simple message. I'm available for consulting services. Please review my standard terms and conditions. Attached. This time, my consulting agreement was even more comprehensive. I demanded full creative control over any system modifications, immunity from internal corporate politics, and a guarantee that my recommendations would be implemented without modification. I also required a formal written apology for the manner of my termination. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I arrived at the Nexora building I'd entered every day for 12 years, now as an outside consultant charging premium rates to fix problems I'd warned them about. The conference room was full of people I recognized. Preston Dale looked like he hadn't slept in days. The CFO was present, along with the director of operations and two people I didn't recognize who were introduced as crisis management specialists. David Morrison opened the meeting with an apology that was as carefully crafted as it was insincere. We recognize that there were communication failures in how your departure was handled. We value your expertise and would like to engage your services to help us resolve our current challenges. I sat quietly and listened to 30 minutes of corporate damage control. They explained how the billing system failure was affecting customer relationships, how the state investigation was creating regulatory pressure, and how they needed my expertise to restore system functionality. Finally, Morrison asked the question they had all been dancing around. What would it take to get our systems back online? I opened my laptop and displayed a detailed project plan I'd prepared. Full system restoration will require approximately 400 hours of specialized consulting work. This includes rebuilding the monitoring systems that were removed, restoring the backup processes that were eliminated, and implementing new safety measures to prevent future failures. I clicked to the next slide, showing my rate structure. Emergency system restoration is billed at crisis consulting rates, with a 50% premium for work performed under regulatory scrutiny. Payment is required upfront for any engagement exceeding 20 hours. The room fell silent as they processed the numbers. My total fee for fixing their system was more than my annual salary had been as an employee. Additionally, I continued. I require a formal acknowledgement that the current crisis was caused by executive decisions to remove critical system components against the documented recommendations of technical staff. Preston Dale spoke up for the first time. Those changes were made to improve system efficiency and reduce operational costs. I turned to look at him directly. How did that work out for you? The CFO cleared his throat. What assurance do we have that these fixes will prevent future problems? I smiled. You're asking the wrong question. The right question is, what assurance do you have that removing me again won't cause the same problems? The room fell silent again. I'll need a decision by tomorrow morning, I said, closing my laptop. Every day of delay increases the complexity of the restoration process and the associated costs. I left the meeting and drove home, feeling lighter than I had in months. The power dynamic had completely reversed. They needed me more than I needed them. And everyone in that room knew it. The decision came at 6 a.m. the next morning. A text message from the CEO. Terms accepted. When can you start? I waited until 9 a.m. to respond. I'll need a formal contract and the first payment before beginning work. I also require a written acknowledgement that this crisis was preventable and occurred due to executive decisions to remove critical system components. The contract arrived by email within 2 hours. The payment was processed by noon. The written acknowledgement was delivered as a PDF with the CEO's electronic signature. I had won, but I wasn't done yet. Instead of immediately fixing their system, I began to document everything that was wrong with it, every shortcut that had been taken, every warning that had been ignored, every best practice that had been abandoned. I created a comprehensive audit trail that showed exactly how the company had gotten into this mess. Then I began to bill them for my time, every hour of analysis, every moment of investigation, every second of documentation, all at premium crisis consulting rates. The first invoice was for 80 hours of system assessment and damage analysis. The second was for 120 hours of restoration planning and risk assessment. The third was for 160 hours of implementation preparation and stakeholder coordination. Each invoice was paid immediately, without question. They were trapped in a crisis of their own making, and I was the only person who could get them out of it. After 3 weeks of analysis and planning, I finally began to actually fix their system. But I did it slowly, methodically, with the careful attention to detail that had made me indispensable in the first place. Every repair came with documentation explaining why it was necessary. Every restored safety mechanism included a detailed explanation of what would happen if it was removed again. Every backup process was accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis showing the value of redundancy. I wasn't just fixing their system, I was creating a paper trail that would make it impossible for them to make the same mistakes again. The restoration took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of premium consulting fees paid up front with no questions asked. 6 weeks of watching executives who had called me replaceable come to understand exactly how wrong they had been. The final invoice was itemized down to the quarter hour. Emergency System Restoration, Phase 3, Implementation and Testing. The total amount was staggering, more than I had made in 2 years as an employee. At the bottom, I added a note: System restoration complete. All critical monitoring and backup processes have been restored to original specifications. Detailed documentation provided for all modifications. Strongly recommend against future removal of safety systems. The payment was processed within an hour, but the real victory came a week later. An email from Janet Stevens, senior partner at Harbor Core Consulting, one of the most prestigious technology consulting firms in the Midwest. Ms. Ellis, your reputation precedes you. We've been following your work on the Nexora Systems Restoration Project, and we're impressed. We'd like to discuss a senior consulting position with our firm. The compensation package would be negotiable, but I believe we can meet whatever terms you might consider reasonable. I read the email 3 times, savoring the professional respect that had been absent from my life for months. Then I began to craft my response. I was no longer Morgan Ellis, the expendable employee who could be dismissed with a form email. I was Morgan Ellis, the system architect who had turned a catastrophic failure into a case study in corporate consequences. I had learned something valuable from my experience at Nexora. The people who build systems are never truly replaceable. They can be dismissed, discarded, and forgotten. But when the systems they built begin to fail, they become the most important people in the room. And when that happens, they get to name their price. The invoice that destroyed Nexora Systems wasn't just a bill for services rendered. It was a statement of value. A declaration that expertise has worth, that experience matters, and that the people who understand how things really work can never be truly replaced. They had fired the only person who understood their system. In response, I had shown them exactly what that understanding was worth. The market rate, it turned out, was higher than they had ever imagined.